Somewhere right now, a woman in her 60s is holding a baby that isn't hers to keep. She raised her own children decades ago. That chapter is closed. By the one rule that seems to matter in nature, her story should already be over. But it isn't, and the reason why is stranger than you'd think. You belong to one of the only species on Earth where the females live for decades after they can no longer have children. Notice how odd that is. A salmon spawns once and dies. Most animals breed right up until the end, because from evolution's cold point of view, a body that can no longer pass on its genes no longer matters. So why are you different? Why does a human woman go through menopause in her late 40s and then keep living, strong and sharp, for another 30 or 40 years? This is not a small question. You treat a long life as normal, but for most of the living world, growing old past your fertile years simply does not happen. The lights go out the moment your usefulness to the next generation ends. Your body broke that rule. And to understand why, you have to go back hundreds of thousands of years to an old woman with a digging stick on the plains of Africa. The first person to really stare at this puzzle was a biologist named George Williams. In 1957, he asked something nobody could answer. If natural selection discards anything that does not help you reproduce, why would it build a creature that spends a third of its life unable to reproduce at all? A trait that useless should have vanished long ago. Unless it was never useless in the first place. Maybe those extra years were not a leftover. Maybe they were the point. Decades later, an anthropologist named Kristen Hawkes went looking for proof, and she found it in Tanzania. She spent years living among the Hadza, one of the last peoples who still hunt and gather the way your ancestors did for almost all of human history. She watched who worked and who ate. And she noticed something she was not expecting. The hardest workers in the whole camp were not the young mothers. They were the old women. While mothers nursed newborns, it was the grandmothers who went out day after day and dug deep for the tough underground tubers that fed everyone. These were not easy calories. They took strength and long hours under the sun. And here is the part that mattered. The children whose grandmothers were strong foragers survived better than the children whose grandmothers were gone. Do you see what that means? An old woman could not have more babies of her own, but she could keep her grandchildren alive, and every grandchild who survived carried a quarter of her genes into the future. Evolution never cared whether she reproduced again. It only cared that her genes kept moving forward, and a living, working grandmother pushed them forward faster than another pregnancy ever could. This became known as the grandmother hypothesis, and it turned the whole story of aging on its head. Because look at what it lets a family do. A grandmother who lives long can pour her energy into the children who already exist and free her own daughter to have the next baby sooner. And in a world with no writing and no doctors, that old woman was also the knowledge. She remembered the drought 40 years ago and where the water still ran. She was the living memory of the tribe. Now, here is the honest part. Not every scientist agrees this is the whole story, and the debate is not fully settled, but the evidence keeps pointing the same way. Again and again, the old woman turns out not to be baggage. She is carrying the tribe. And if you think humans are alone in this, you are wrong. Far out in the cold ocean, killer whales do almost exactly the same thing. The females stop breeding in their 30s or 40s, and then live for decades more. A researcher named Darren Croft spent years watching these pods. The old females lead. When the salmon grows scarce and the pod is hungry, it is the oldest grandmother whale who remembers where the fish gathered during the last famine and guides everyone there. And when she dies, her grown sons are far more likely to die soon after. An old whale and an old woman, separated by 50 million years and an entire ocean, arriving at the same rare answer. Live long, stop breeding, lead, feed. Remember, that is not a coincidence. That is nature finding the same truth twice. So what does this mean for the way you see growing old? You live in a world that quietly worships youth, that treats getting older as a slow fading. An older woman especially is often treated as though nature is finished with her. But nature is telling you the exact opposite. The long life of a grandmother is not a mistake the body forgot to switch off. It is one of the most powerful survival tools your species ever evolved. Your ancestors did not survive in spite of their old women. They survived because of them. So think about a grandmother in your own family, the one who showed up when a baby was born, who watched the children, who told the same stories until you knew every word. It is easy to see that as sweet, but small. It is not small. It is one of the oldest patterns in the human story, written into your species by the simple fact that the families who did it survived, and the ones who did not are gone. Somewhere right now, a woman in her 60s is holding a baby that isn't hers to keep. She raised her own children long ago, and by every rule that governs the rest of the living world, her story should already be over. It isn't over. It never was. It is the reason you are here.